Okay, thank you very much. So I'm just think if you are still alive, and I want to invite you to really just conclude this with some more general discussion, and I may kind of start with when I thought about doing this kind of conference. Since I'm not involved in doing digital approaches to genocide studies, I thought about what is the digital, and what comes to mind as a kind of naive historian, it's just kind of the binary of the 0 and the 1, right? So you have this kind of pair of two numbers, which then kind of leads into where Todd started off, also showing us these kind of dichotomies. And I just want to give you some examples which I noticed throughout the conference. And in the beginning, they seemed really more like kind of juxtapositions, more like dichotomies than binaries. So for example, analog, digital. The GIS of it's good for perpetrators, but not for victims. The accuracy of data, on the other hand, the uncertainty. Yeah, digital narration and authorship. And here you see already that there is it's going away from the juxtaposition, and it gets more kind of fuzzy in a way. Analysis, and we talked about this when with Caroline just now, and sensitive empathy. Are they exclusive? Yeah, or are they combined? Do they have? Can they go together? Abstraction and the particular. We talked also just now about a really big problem: access and ownership. What about the individual versus the group? This was just collapsing when the term was thrown out, the network self. Yeah, so I think here already you see that the contradictions probably are not so big contradictions. Thinking about the abstract mass and the individual that leads to a pattern, which is kind of the opposite what we actually think about abstract things and individuals. Yeah? Normally the individual is the mass and the abstract is the clarity and the kind of the overview. So, and maybe at the last point I had is the static and the animation. And the interesting thing for me was that the animation in one of the maps humanized the whole digital. Yeah. So this was what blew me away, yeah, today. And I think this I want to just throw at you and hope that you kind of comment, and especially thinking about, first of all, what does the digital for us? Where can we go in the future? I mean, also, this should not just be a collection of interesting projects. It should also kind of make us think where we can head. And I think just to mention one thing, the Shoah Foundation, we talked about tagging during the conference. So the Visual History Archive in the future will be, or is currently overgoing a total overhaul with new interface. And in the future, we will have possibilities to tag on the testimonies with, you can tag on articles, comments. We will have kind of discussion forums for particular events or particular interviews. And I also think about what would be greatly appreciated from the side of the Shoah Foundation as the main organizer of this is also feedback where we should go as scholars, what is needed. For example, when you go to a database and like the Visual History Archive, what do you want to do with it beyond just using the digital sources? So that's from my part. So please feel free to comment, discuss, throw other things out. You want to start? Oh,
I'm curious whether you all feel that you entered the conference feeling skeptical and now you're less skeptical, or if it's gone in the other direction.
Are we just putting questions on the table, or are we trying to answer? Yeah, this is all questions. Yeah.
General comment, discussion.
I'm here as a former scholar who's now a narrative media maker and storyteller, so I'm really interested in what the relationship is between scholarship and academia and narrative storytelling. I think we know how powerful it is, and so what would be the things for narrative creators to take from this technology, this data, this information, because I think we need to be much more responsible, or I can speak, well, I try to be responsible, but I don't always think my colleagues are. We need to be much more responsible as well and aware of our power. So I think there's a lot to be learned. And just if you guys had thoughts for narrative creators, how do we use this information and the scholarly work you all do that's so much deeper than most narrative creators are getting to really be responsible in our representations of these types of stories?
I've just had a couple of points, I guess, that are connected to materiality and archaeology, because obviously, as you know, that's where I'm coming from. But just probably things that may be relevant for many people in this room. The first is that obviously what we've heard a lot about in the course of this conference is the generation of new types of data sets, and also a lot of very, very large data sets. And a lot of us are using existing archive material, but we're also creating our own archives. And I think I've been talking to a couple of people about this over the last few days, for example, about the existence of the data that we generate and where it resides and how much access other researchers and other members of the public have. So, for example, the types of visualizations that we're creating from the laser scanning data or the 3D renders of objects, for example, currently reside on our Center of Archaeology server, and we would very much like them to eventually enter the public record, to become an archive in and amongst themselves. And to pick up on the point about ethics, one of the things that we haven't, I guess, mentioned too much is that kind of interface between the physical memorials and representations on site, and the role that the digital plays in terms of complementing or sometimes substituting for that. And Kevin and I, just to give a specific example, wrote a paper a number of years ago now about a site that we work on in the UK Channel Islands, in the British Channel Islands, I should say, whereby they absolutely do not want on-site representations. They do not want memorial spaces. They don't want on-site markers. And we've used the digital in that sense as a way of actually making sure that those that do want to learn about the crimes that were perpetrated there have the opportunity to do so. Of course, that in itself throws up many, many ethical questions, I realise, but I just thought I'd kind of put that on the table as another possibility for digital means as well.
A kind of trying to tie some things together. I mean, the binaries that Wolf started with, I think, are also related to, at least my experience from Anne's question, in the sense that I certainly came in here thinking I was actually more on the fence about some of the digital methods that we use. I came away thinking much more positively about them, but my absence, and it relates also to the narrative comment, I thought that, wow, there's a lot of this is so much outwardly projected to the memorialization project, projected to the communities, to the narratives. But I wondered if our colleagues in genocide history and studies would recognize the urgency of our own questions that deal with narratives and aesthetics and modes of presentation. And so there's actually, I got a little nervous about halfway through this conference thinking, other Holocaust historians, are they going to recognize us? Do we talk about testimony as something that is embedded, for example, in social and political relationships? Politics, for example, hasn't really come up. The Nazi Party, there's something that hasn't been mentioned in 2 days. So it's an interesting. I'm not saying that that's bad. I'm just wondering if that's recognizable. If we're going in one direction, which is about sources and methods, and we're leaving behind other questions, perhaps for good reasons, in order to focus on things like communities and narratives. I mean, so what are we leaving behind? I think Joanna kind of raised that, I think, yeah.
I thought important was also that in several presentations we talked about contextualization, which is important for the digital. I think which is in some ways sometimes kind of left out. And I think this is an important process to actually bring the regular historian to the digital, is the contextualization. Yeah.
I think I'll just comment to you since no one has their hand up. I think there's also a kind of seduction of the tool that we've gotten into a little bit at the conference in terms of like this tool, that tool, this tool. And even me, I get really enthralled and excited. And then I sometimes am so caught up in like this cool method or this cool way of seeing that I'm not pushing myself to think about what new question is this going to answer that we haven't asked yet, or what new pattern is this going to allow us to identify. So I think, I mean, that's part of my kind of, one of the things I'm taking away is like, am I being seduced by tools at the expense of not really pushing myself on the questions that we're asking?
I think thinking about your question, Anne, in terms of coming to this conference, I think at various parts of the conference, I've both been completely intrigued and fearful and maybe slightly disturbed at certain points, but also I think leaving the conference also inspired by thinking about the possibilities of the questions that, not really only the questions we could be asking, but the answers we could get, and that would inspire other questions. But I think just being on the panel right now, with your research on University of Manitoba, I think it just continues to make me think how much more important it is to continue to think about how, you know, whether it's societally or institutionally, we have to rethink how we fund projects and how we look at projects to kind of give up more ownership and to give up more control and to be able to allow communities to take control of their stories themselves. And I think we talk about this in archives a lot, is how do we let the voices represent themselves? And so continuing to think about how do we let that work, how do we let that influence the work that we do, and to continue to embody empathy more, especially with all of us who work with genocide studies. We're dealing with people who are often in communities outside of our own, who we may not necessarily have all the cultural competencies for or language skills. And so how do we continue to collaborate with people rather than to, you know, like I was mentioning earlier, that building trust with the community isn't a means to an end, but how do we build these, you know, honest and good relationships in order to tell each other's stories? So I think it's brought me to a more hopeful place, but kind of thinking more deeply about that.
I'll be very quick. I just want to kind of express my thanks to a number of presenters' presentations who took the time to reveal how the thing was done. You know, not just this is what we did, but also this is how we did it. And it made me wonder if one of the barriers between the historian who does not work with the digital and the historian who does is not simply competencies and literacies, but something like the confidence to use a tool set for the first time. And I wondered whether or not there could be something like a sort of intellectual GitHub where, you know, where people who are, you know, minded to do so can say, here's the project, this is what we did, these are the tools that you too could use, you know, these are the conversations we then could have. And whether, I mean, it strikes me this conference was kind of a sort of in a small way, an exposition of that model. Maybe it would be possible for such a thing to, I mean, if not maintained, we know how much that costs, but at least to be sort of built. And then we might see something like the explosion in sort of complementary methodologies and consequent projects that, I mean, it seems to me we haven't seen in digital humanities for a while, right? I mean, anyway, just a small thing.
To connect to what you just said, you just made me think about something. There is a lot of these work, most of the works that we have seen so far have a characteristic of being interdisciplinary and collaborative. I don't think I've seen any presentation, maybe one or two, in which there was somebody working alone. And so I think this is a characteristic of these the digital world. It's very collaborative because it requires a lot of different skills. So maybe an historian can go to the archive, write the book, and be quite independent in that, or build on other scholarships. But I think by its nature and your project, I mean all of your project, I'm sure you had a lot of different competence, and so that's something that strikes me. The other thing is, and as a geographer, I'm happy. I never heard talking about geography so much, which is great. A lot more than I expected before. It's people talking about space and place. It just opens the heart of a geographer. Warms the heart. That's Italian. Opens the heart is an Italian expression. Okay.
Sorry. Okay, just very quickly follow up on Alberto's comments. I was also struck by the sensibility on questions of space, scale, volumetrics, and everything that has to do with space in general. And I find this very welcoming, to tell you the truth. I think it has been a dimension in our studies of the Holocaust and other genocides that has been long missing, and it's interesting that it's now at the forefront of developments at the digital field. I personally think that we can push the collaborative aspect even more. I was at a conference together with Steve in June in Venice, and there was a lot of talk about LOD, so linked open data, and how data can be shared and several interfaces can be developed so that things can multiply, spread, and conquer the world. So I'm, given the fact that Stephen is here and that there is a willingness to more closely, several archives collaborate more closely, I think this is also a way forward, how that is to think not only in collaborative terms, but also in terms of interfaces, of making our work translatable or open or applicable to other projects, and therefore this way build up. I think if there is something missing in the conventional study of the Holocaust, is definitely the comparative aspect. The symmetrical or the asymmetrical, it doesn't really matter. And I think there is an opportunity to actually push toward that direction.
Before Annika speaks, I just wanted to kind of respond to this. I think collaboration, that's actually really key for all the projects, I think. And I was not so kind of taken away by the beauty of the projects, more by actually the transdisciplinarity, which I found a great term, which is here really kind of significant for the whole conference. And but just to say, there was the question, what are we doing with our data collection when we kind of create our own archives? So, for example, one possibility for collaboration would be, we are thinking here about creating a genocide archive. So maybe, and also digital one. So the question is, maybe we could centralize data collection here at USC. This would be an opportunity. I mean, we are definitely thinking about things to digitize materials, to house them here as copies, but data collection could be another part of this. Just throwing this out. Annika, sorry.
Fine. So I don't have to talk more about collaboration. I think there were very good statements on it. But I think it is one of the very exciting elements, I think, of digital work that both facilitates, but kind of also kind of enables a lot more collaboration than we've had before. But I wanted to talk a bit more about what Paul had already brought in, which I think is just the relationship between experience and representation, which is one of the very central questions in the Holocaust studies for a number of years, which for me is very, very closely related to the ethical questions. And then that's where some of the digital methods or tools or maybe even toys that we're having at this point, I think we have to be very, very careful with. And in particular, I'm struck by some of the possibilities for creating virtual realities that I'm kind of excited about. I think they're great educational tools, maybe, but also something makes me cringe because they kind of, I think, they kind of ignore human constants like the passing of time and the fact that people die, and that, like Pinchas Goodman, for example, has the project thought about what happens when he passes away? It's going to be a very different project once he's not alive anymore. But also for the audience to recognize that survivors have passed away, and so what does it mean that we have a virtual survivor that is going to outlive all of us? So there's some questions that I think we still have to think about very, very carefully, and not kind of overusing the possibilities that we have in trying to create or recreate something that actually is destroyed. I mean, the genocide was a reality, and it has destroyed things that we cannot repair. So that's for me is kind of a very, very central takeaway from this conference, and generally from thinking about digital approaches. This is more the ethical questions for us as scholars, as citizens, as people.
I've never been at a conference where ethics came up so often, and I also have never been to a digital conference before, and I've been going to digital conferences of one kind or another for at least 15 years, depending on how you count it, maybe 20, that has taken its work, where the people have taken their work so seriously. And it's thrilling to me to be among you. To be in this sort of intellectual community where things matter and people think very carefully about everything from evidence and citation to modes of representation and what language you use. And I don't think that the quality of intellectual exchange and critique that's gone on here can be easily exported to other fields. I guess what I'm really thinking is that because genocide is freighted with such weight of every kind in human experience and our thoughts, the quality of work coming out of this group may be a light to digital humanities more broadly. And I don't know how we share it in any way like that. Maybe we don't need to. But anyway, this is sort of to say I'm enormously impressed by what I've seen here, and I'm very grateful to all of you.
It was a little surreal. I guess I'm just to add 2 cents, right? Like, I think I'm interested in audiences, and I think particularly I'm interested in the general public and creating a kind of public discourse about the kinds of intersections that we've been exploring here. I mean, I think a lot, the implied audience of many of our remarks here has been scholarly, and that's good. But I think there is this other audience out there, and if we're talking about the humanities generally, which certainly in Canada is alienated from the general public in all kinds of ways, I mean, I think the work of translation is an important job of work that we need to think about as well, right? We need to find ways to talk about I've been mystified by at least some of what people have talked about here, and I'll have to go, and I've made notes, so I'm going to go look it up. But if, there are people who will really be struggling to make sense of both approach and outcome, and I think the work of translation is a work that we still have to do with the general public in mind.
I just wanted to respond to Anne's comment. So when I've talked to Holocaust scholars before, it's always, keep in mind the weightiness of the topic is so obvious, and you're always so concerned about how to deal with these emotional issues. Whereas I deal with, the European conquest in the New World, where we're often not dealing with emotion that must have accompanied this. So to me, seeing the digital tool is not so much frightening that that the empathy may be disembodied from the study, but the fact that the empathy could be added in. Because we take indigenous erasures across the American continent so for granted, or don't even think of it at all. So in that sense, I would argue the digital tool can be a tool to retell a story long forgotten and to bring the emotion back in. And I can see why many of you all are afraid of the power of these tools, but I just want to bring that as a counter perspective.
I think that's a good point, and you don't even need to say to bring empathy back in, because I think if you actually use digital tools to tell the story, there is the empathy. That's actually why you do it. And I think, and also when you do this and when you develop these tools or these questions using these tools, then actually it also transfers to the audience. And I'm not really sure if we really need a translation there. So I'm kind of hesitating a little bit. What is the translation? I mean, you can think about people unfamiliar with digital, let's say, the digital landscape in general. Or what are you? Maybe you need to be a little bit more precise what you mean with what needs to be translated.
Minimally, I think some of the technical operations need to be translated, and for example, the taking of the use of data. What is data? How do we and what is a map? What is a digital map? How do we put these terms together? And what we do, what we take for granted when we sort of intersect the various bits and pieces of our projects makes sense to us because we've thought about it, we have outcomes in view. The general public doesn't necessarily understand the process particularly well, but I think they also maybe don't understand the purpose particularly well. Like, why more layers of information about something? Like, we know the Holocaust is bad. Like we know, so what's the value added, I guess? And I think there's a lot of value added, obviously, but I think from a general public perspective, the general public's perspective, it's not always evident.
I would counter this actually, but sometimes the public actually understands a message via digital tools much better than we could do it before. For example, I don't know if you were at the talk in Australia during the Brisbane conference, where this elderly scholar from Australia who works for decades on the destruction of the indigenous communities. She wrote several books about this. And she complained that she never reached the public with all their books. And then she embarked on really late in her career, on a digital project mapping execution sites, massacre sites in Australia. And she showed us just one image, the Australian continent bordered by a line of dots at the coast where all the massacres happened. And she said, that I show this map, people understand. And I think, so you can see this from the very different angle where practically the public actually needs these tools to get approached.
But that's a great example. If I was there, I did see the session. And you know what's interesting about that? She showed up on the news. She was interviewed. She was interviewed extensively. I mean, she took that work and she translated it for people who then developed the kind of interest that made it into the thing that it became, right? Like, I'm just saying there's that extra step required, I think, at some point. I'm doing more and more public intellectual work. I think that we all should be doing public intellectual work, you know?
I think this is probably one of the first genocide conferences I've ever been to where the United Nations Genocide Convention I don't think has been mentioned once. And as much as I'm thankful for that and not to get bogged down in definitional debates, I think the genocide issue has been somewhat submerged, and yet what I see a lot here are some very interesting tools that I think have great purpose for understanding the processual, the diachronic, the nature, the collective nature of genocide, which I think is moving us from a genocide studies perspective beyond the old liberal tradition where genocide was, simply addressed through the individual experience. So I'm thankful for that I see potential in a lot of the research projects here.
I have a microphone already. Thanks. I really enjoyed the last 2 days in the fact that so many of the presentations engaged in a mixture of technical as well as methodological as well as ethical discussions, as well as looking at certain research questions and trying to answer them, and how I don't think I've ever been to a conference which has merged that to such a strong degree. And at some points I sat here thinking, okay, so what's the question which is being, sort of my political science training was like, okay, where's the research question? What's the hypothesis here? And how's it being tested? And I was like, oh, well, it's not happening. But in some of the presentations, I thought, but then I thought, no, this is really inspiring to me because I'm having ideas on the ethics of collecting data, of representing data, different technologies. And I thought there was the whole mix of this which came together, and the different presentations kept speaking to each other in very different ways that I found really inspiring. And this is exactly how I imagine interdisciplinary work to be. That a political scientist can sit here listening to a geographer and be completely inspired by something which I have no idea how to do, but I have an inkling of what that means for research that I do. And I just wanted to commend the organizers for putting together such an amazing program which brings together really, really disparate projects, but that all really spoke to each other. I was really impressed, and I've taken a lot away from this.
I came to the conference with a worry, and I've now, it has come back to my mind. And this is a kind of a thought that I've been having for quite some time. It also relates to the fact that some, at least, of the papers, at least when it comes to the technical language, to the vocabulary applied, it really sounded like Greek to me. In the sense of being so nothing. So, I mean, it partly has to do with whatever language competency, but also with training. But I wonder whether there is a larger issue here, which relates to collaboration, relates to interdisciplinarity, but perhaps it also relates to the emergence of a kind of a group of experts, of IT experts, that can actually control the techniques or decide upon the kind of arcane or obscure or untranslatable techniques that transform our ideas into some sort of software program or whatever. And that their role has both to be acknowledged, but also, kind of deconstructed. I think this is a critical moment in this respect, when it comes to the history of humanities. History became a profession in the late 19th century. Perhaps there's something here, that we see something emerging. We think of ourselves, or I sometimes think of myself as dependent on the skills of others. That these are somehow both empower me, but at the same time limit me. And I cannot control it. Now, of course, there are different layers. Okay, I cannot control my computer, I cannot control my laptop. But I think there is some sort of a qualitative difference here. Difference in scale, perhaps. That changes the thing.
But on the other hand, you can also say you are actually shaping the people what they actually do, because you ask the question what they and you ask them to do certain things for you, right? So they would not do this on their own because they don't have a clue what you are working on, what the topic is. They just kind of translate what your vision is there.
I agree, but if they told me that cannot be done, I mean, it's like an instrument maker, right? No matter how much I want a flute to play, I don't know, 4 times louder, that cannot be done. And it's the instrument maker that tells me that. And I cannot do anything about it. It doesn't work. No.
But I think in our scenario, it is all what we just said. The collaboration is the key here. And I didn't see any of the presentations actually where you have an isolated technical issue at hand. It's all connected to the topic. It's connected to the goal of the research. And what I found the most amazing, what I didn't expect, was that almost every presentation actually had, let's say, used massive data, but broke it down to the individual experience. And I think if you have this, not so much can go wrong there. Yeah, I think this was for me the most amazing thing to see. Because I expected much more like this, yeah, you collect data and then you have massive data and then that's it. But almost everybody who uses the data also goes to the experience of the individual, because without them, the massive data are actually nothing. Yeah. Should we wrap it up? So I have to, now it's that part. First of all, I wanted to give back the applause from Timothy. I have to thank for the applications, because I was really kind of benefiting from the quality of the proposals we got, and we had a really hard time to choose. So I think to thank you all who applied and then actually made it even better when doing the presentations, and I really enjoyed our discussions here. So I have to thank everybody for this. I thank especially Martha and Marika, and also Shefali, who's not here, and Emily, who done the first part of the preparation of the conference. I think this was amazing work, and I'm really glad to have this team. And just to reveal this, since I'm on sabbatical actually, so they really did the most work during the last weeks, I have to say. I really have a bad conscience in this, but to keep my sanity, I needed to be off campus for a while. So this is really a big thanks. And I think this was, in my view, really a very productive gathering. And I don't know, maybe at some point, at some other place, we can actually proceed and go further with this. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you also to the audio technicians, the video.